morning this morning. Worry, anxiety and fear are some of the most common emotions people experience every day, perhaps to an even greater extent over the last couple of years. And because it's so common, many of us have started to wonder if worry is in fact inescapable. I think the expression worrying ourselves to death encapsulates the idea that we're not only prone to anxiety, but it can take over our lives from time to time. Worry is a thief. It steals the joy of living in the present moment. It steals our sleep in the middle of the night. It steals our time because it doesn't actually achieve anything. I think we'd all love to banish worry from our lives, wouldn't we? And yet Jesus' simple exhortation, do not worry about your life, seems way too simplistic. Is it really that easy? Because it seems like you may as well tell yourself to stop breathing as to stop worrying at times. In today's passage in Luke, Jesus addresses the reality of worry, and he speaks directly to the hearts of those who are weighed down with anxiety and fear by asking them a question, and it's a question we're going to be considering a little bit later on. And we'll find that he not only gives us an exhortation not to worry, but a prescription as to how to banish it from our lives. And in so doing, he lets us in on the secret to finding peace in the face of fear and anxiety. But first, let's consider the reality of worry. Anxiety is an important part of how God actually designed us. We need it to survive. When respected as a valuable part of our internal alert system, anxiety has lots of benefits. It can signal the presence of a fear that needs our attention. It can inform us that our mind or our body are overwhelmed. It can protect us by warning us of things that might go wrong. And it can alert us to a potential danger and help us to plan ahead. But it's at that point that healthy worry or anxiety can start to impact us negatively. When we start worrying excessively about all that could go wrong, then we can experience an emotional and sometimes physiological response to possible future events, which may or may not be tethered to reality and which may or may not come true, and in most cases don't. This kind of worry worries about things that haven't happened yet, but which might go wrong. And it's usually accompanied by thoughts which lodge in our heads and our hearts and can start to control us. I think it's helpful at this point to differentiate this kind of worry from concern. Concern's an important part of our lives where we consider a particular aspect of our lives that needs addressing and then we get on with addressing it. So when you go home and you look in the fridge and you realise you haven't got any food, you don't think, oh no, I'm going to starve. You say, I think I need to get down to the local supermarket and buy some food, or get online and put an online order in. Your concern prompts you to do something to deal with the thing that you're concerned about. That's how concern functions in our life. If we didn't ever get concerned about things, our lives and our world wouldn't work very well. But there's a fine line between appropriate concern and debilitating worry. Concern generally leads to purposeful action, but worry leads to paralysis and inactivity. But eliminating this kind of worry from our lives seems easier said than done, doesn't it? In the passage we're about to look at, Jesus begins by addressing some concerns about the basic stuff of survival, which have actually become causes for worry in the lives of his hearers. And it sets the stage for today's question in our Questions Jesus Asked series, which is, who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Which he then follows up with, why do you worry? But this is how he starts. Then Jesus said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear, for life is more than food and the body more than clothes. Many of Jesus' hearers had only just enough to live on. And there was always the prospect that one day they wouldn't even have that. Most of them would have perhaps only had one spare garment, but not more. And as with many in today's non-Western world, it might have only taken one disaster the family breadwinner getting sick or injured, for example, to bring about instant destitution. And it was to people like that Jesus gave his clear and his striking commands to not worry about food or clothing. But for us, these core provisions, they sort of tend to spill over into a broader palette of concern, don't they? Concerns that frequently seem to be just as crucial to us and end up becoming causes for debilitating worry in our lives. We might worry, will I ever get a job? Or the job that I want, or will I be able to do it? Will I be able to keep that job? Or we might worry before showing up at a gathering of some people we haven't met before. Will I be accepted? Will they like me? Or we might worry, will I ever be loved by someone? Or find a lifelong partner? Or get married, if that's something that you want? And if I do get married, will my marriage last? Will my spouse betray me? Or who will look after my spouse if I pass away first? And if we do get married, we might worry, will we ever be able to buy a house? Or will we be able to have children? And if we do, will they be all right in this world? Will they ever leave the house? Or maybe we worry about our health. Will I get cancer? Will I ever be able to overcome a particular addiction? And all these worries start to control and to consume us, and they lodge in our heads and our hearts. And it's no wonder that the most common exhortation in the Bible, right from Genesis through to Revelation, is simply this: don't be afraid. Because being fearful and feeling insecure are a couple of things that we human beings do best, don't we? There's so much to be afraid of, so much that could go wrong, so much to worry about, and we have so little control over it. And so worry seems unavoidable and inescapable, doesn't it? Well, I'm going to suggest to you today that even though do not worry seems easier said than done, that worry is not unavoidable. So let's lean in intently and listen to Jesus as he speaks words of life, not only to the heavy-laden hearts of his hearers, but to our worry-filled hearts today as well. And as we do, I think we'll be encouraged by some of the reasons that we find there as to why we don't need to worry. But before we do, if you're anything like me, and some of you might be, there are occasions when your anxious thoughts might be rampant and raging to the point that you're not able to calm yourself down and settle your thoughts enough so that you can focus rationally on the kinds of things that we're talking about today. There was a time when I experienced that. I couldn't seem to dislodge the anxious thoughts in my mind, and they were starting to control me. And I went to see a Christian psychologist for some specialised help with my anxiety at the time. And she shared with me something that really helped when I noticed unhelpfully anxious thoughts running rampant in my mind, as I anticipated every possible thing that could possibly go wrong in the future. And it's the concept of a stop sign. The idea is to imagine it in your mind's eye when you recognise that your thoughts are unhelpful and out of control, in order to stop that particular train or trains of thought. I'd often have a whole rail yard full of them, trains of thought, that is. But it's exactly what Paul was talking to the Corinthians about when he encouraged them to take captive every thought to the obedience of Christ. And then after you've stopped yourself thinking unhelpful thoughts by putting up the stop sign, you can replace them then with helpful ones that are obedient to Christ, ones that are the kinds of truths we're going to be talking about today. But sometimes we just don't have the presence of mind or the ability to recognise that what we actually need to do is to put up that stop sign in our mind. Or it's just way too hard to do it on our own. We know that Jesus says, do not worry, but it just seems like we can't not worry. It's the difference between being anxious and being medically anxious. Do not worry helps you when you're anxious, but when you're medically anxious, do not worry doesn't usually help that much. It's like saying to someone with high blood pressure, don't have high blood pressure. That's not really helpful, is it? I wish I'd known that earlier. I just didn't have to have it. When you're medically anxious, you need medical help. I've been in that place And it took a couple of years and several panic attacks and a lot of encouragement from those closest to me to take a step that I'd been putting off for a long time. I came to realise that part of trusting God in this instance was to make an appointment to see my doctor and to accept the fact that taking medication might actually help me. And you know what? It has. The medical help helps. It's helped to calm my rampant thoughts, and I'm now able to take every thought captive and choose to stop thinking unhelpful thoughts. And I'm more able to redirect my thinking towards helpful and Jesus-centred thoughts. So if you're thinking this might be something that would make a difference to you, as it has for me, I can testify that Jesus has been with me in that journey and is helping me. If you think you might be medically anxious, not just anxious, let me encourage you to take a first step and go and see a doctor to talk about what might be helpful for you. As I was contemplating sharing this today, I was initially quite hesitant. I didn't really have a good enough reason not to share. There was probably a fair dose of anxiety about what people might think of me, which is a little bit ironic given the topic of today's worry. But I was also reminded of the fact that if I had high blood pressure and yet chose not to take the very medication that would have helped me, then people would really have cause to be worried, I think. I hope that here at Syndal, we're on our way towards becoming the kind of community where it's okay to not be okay and to be able to talk about these kinds of things with others and to open up these kinds of conversations. And that we can embrace and encourage each other in our struggles and in our brokenness in whatever area it is. And walk alongside one another as we journey more and more towards the kind of wholeness that Jesus is calling us to in every aspect of our lives. Okay, so having said all that, let's get on to what Jesus has to say about worry. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you'll eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap, they have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds." It's really interesting the way that Jesus starts here, isn't it? Notice he doesn't say, if anyone is anxious, you need to repent. Or if anyone is worried, you need to confess your sin and your guilt. Or if anyone is afraid, you need to admit that you're not trusting God. He doesn't go there at all, does he? What does he say? He says, if you're worried, remember your worth. And he says, remember your worth in the eyes of God. And that's the first reason that you and I don't need to worry, because God cares for us. So in light of that, let's remember our worth. Consider the ravens, Jesus says. God feeds them, and how much more valuable you are than birds. I love how Jesus doesn't just say that God provides for the ravens or that he gives them what they need. He doesn't, does he? He actually says God feeds them, and that's different. That's so much more personal. That's so much more intimate. That's so much more tender, isn't it? It invokes an image of God feeding them out of the palm of his hands. It's a personal interaction. It's not just some impersonal scattering of seed into the wind. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of feeding a bird out of the palm of your hand, but we get these beautiful king parrots down at the holiday house we have access to down at Lawn, and there have been times when one of them will trust us enough to alight on our fingertips and take the opportunity for one intimate moment to feed. Not intimate if you're scared of birds or anything, but to feed on some seed from the palm of your hands. Our hands. That's the kind of intimacy that Jesus is describing here as he talks about God feeding the ravens. It's meant to be a picture of the way in which God feeds us. In Leviticus chapter 11, there's this whole paragraph dedicated to listing the types of birds that were to be regarded as unclean. And right in the middle of it, it actually says any kind of raven is unclean. And so what we see here in Luke is that God's not only concerned about creatures as small and insignificant as birds, but he also cares about those creatures that were even deemed unclean. And if so, then how much more must he care for you? how much more valuable you are than birds. We don't need to worry because God cares for us. Do you know how much you're worth? Do you know that you're worth that much? Do you know that he loves you that much? Remember your worth. And while we're talking about birds, earlier on in Luke, Jesus is talking about sparrows rather than ravens. In Matthew's version of it, he says this: "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You're worth more than many sparrows." You know, considering these birds, whether it be ravens or sparrows, it's kind of a bit of a two-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, God cares for the ravens and he cares for the sparrows, but they still fall to the ground. We've just read, haven't we? And that's because God doesn't actually promise that difficult things aren't going to happen to us. To them, to the birds, or to us. Sometimes horrendous things happen. Sometimes, we can be at a total loss for words. We can't count on the fact that difficult things won't happen to us, to those of us God cares for. But what we can count on, even if we can't see it at the time, is that God uses difficult things for our good and to bring about his purposes. Remember Joseph and his response to the betrayal and the ill treatment at the hands of his brothers. This is what he said: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Joseph was a type of Jesus, wasn't he? Jesus, who willingly submitted himself to the will of his Father, who was handed over to a cruel death, separated from the Father so that we wouldn't ever have to be. We don't need to worry because God cares for us, so much so that he handed over his own Son to take on our condemnation so that we wouldn't have to. Do you know that you're worth that much to him? Let's remember our worth. Then comes our question of the day in the next part of the passage. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Consider how the wild flowers grow. They do not labour or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendour was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? We also do need to worry because worry doesn't achieve anything. So that means we need to accept our limits. In the face of worry and anxiety, let's accept that we're limited. Jesus is essentially saying here, there are certain things we simply cannot do and that we're helpless to accomplish. And that can be a little bit hard to swallow, can't it? Because, maybe you pride yourself in being a high-capacity person who can get things done and who can make a difference. And we like to think that we can be anyone, do anything if we just set our minds to it. We like to think that, and in many ways that's a great thing, isn't it? But at this moment in history, whether it be COVID or Russia and the Ukraine or the floods, we're being confronted with our own vulnerability and our helplessness and our limitations. That there isn't actually much that we can do to help make a difference in these crises. And so Jesus, in the midst of our worry and anxiety, he says, don't forget, there are simply some things you cannot do. And actually, if we learn to accept our limits, we'll find the secret to experiencing peace in an age of anxiety. Jesus used an illustration of wild flowers this time. Those that would bloom one day and then die the next. And he reminds us that they can't labour or spin. They can't physically make their own garments. They've reached their limitations when it comes to clothing themselves. And yet precisely in the place where these flowers meet their limitations and realise there's nothing more they can do, it's where they experience the extravagant power and provision of God. And Jesus says, learn from them. Learn from that. What if we were to begin to see our limits not as unfortunate restrictions that we would regret, but as extravagant gifts to embrace? Our limits can actually be where we find our rest and our joy, our hope and our peace. In our limits, we remind ourselves that we're not God. And that's good news to our world. We're not God, and we're so woefully unqualified for that role, even if we think we are. One of the roots of our worry is this feeling or this constant low-grade sense that we should be doing more, that things are out of control, that we're not doing enough, and deep down inside, we actually fear that we're not enough, that we'll never be able to measure up. But what if Jesus is saying that we were never meant to? That we're never meant to rule the world? That we're never meant to be in control? What if that's somebody else's job? What if accepting our limits is actually the secret to finding our freedom and our joy? What if accepting our limits was to have the effect of turning us toward God in our need, toward God in prayer? What if he's turning us as a church toward him in prayer at this time? On the one hand, there couldn't be a more poignant symbol of human helplessness and weakness than prayer as we sit alone in a room or someplace else. Our body's not doing anything, and all we seem to be doing is speaking out words into thin air. And yet precisely in that moment of helplessness, we're connecting with the eternal power of God himself through the Spirit of God. It's precisely where our limitations and our weakness slam into the power and the grace of God. I wonder if the reason you worry is that you haven't accepted your limits. Maybe you're still trying to do things you're simply not meant to do, or thinking that you should be able to, instead of allowing your weakness to bring you to your knees in helplessness and trust, recognising that prayer is the place where you'll find and you'll connect with the eternal power of God himself in Jesus. Paul says this to the Philippians in a familiar part of his letter to many of us. Don't fret or worry. Instead of worrying, pray. Let petitions and praises shape your worries into prayers, letting God know your concerns. Before you know it, a sense of God's wholeness, everything coming together for good, will come and settle you down. It's wonderful what happens when Christ displaces worry at the centre of your life. So when we're inclined to worry, let's remember our worth and let's accept our limits. And then Jesus says, and do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Do not worry about it, for the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. So we also don't need to worry because God promises to provide what we need. And the encouragement to us in light of this is to embrace our purpose. Jesus is essentially saying to us, don't set your heart on the things of this world. Don't spend your energy worrying about acquiring things or on mere activity. Don't build your life on the satisfaction of meeting your own desires and needs. You don't need to run after or to worry about those things because you've got a Father who knows that you need them and who's promised to provide you with that. You are made for more than this. He's saying, unlike the ravens and the wild flowers who are driven almost entirely by their survival instincts, he says, we are made in the image of God and we are designed to live for purpose and meaning. Jesus is hinting here that we're meant to be asking and seeking about these kinds of things. What am I supposed to be doing here on earth? Why have you placed me here at this point in time? And he's reminding all of us that if we're his followers, there's one purpose that's meant to surpass all purposes, and it's this: to seek his kingdom. And these things will be given to you as well. That means we're to live every part of our life as someone who's a citizen of another kingdom, bearing witness through our words and our actions to the power of the gospel. And it means that every single day our role is to alert those around us to the universal reign of God in Jesus Christ and the purpose that we've found in him. Because the truth is that none of us will ever find freedom from worry. We'll never find peace if we haven't found our purpose in living for him. Jesus' teaching here, it isn't just an exhortation not to worry. It's not just a prescription for a happy, worry-free life. It's actually a challenge as to what's at the very centre of our world. Who or what are we living for? So he asks us here, have you been seeking the kingdom of God with your whole life? Is it the singular animating purpose of your life? Is it the one thing that you're living for? Is it first and foremost, or is it just one among many, third or fourth on the list maybe? Jesus says we can seek his kingdom first because we've got a Father in heaven who knows what we need and a shepherd who's promised to provide us with it, so we'll never be in want. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. The kingdom first and foremost. It's about God's sovereignty sweeping the whole world with love and power so that human beings, those of us who are made in the image of God and dearly loved by him, can relax in the knowledge that he is in control. And so worry and fear don't need to be. He's our creator, our Father, our shepherd. He loves to give good gifts. He loves to give us the kingdom. He loves to bring his sovereign care and rescue right to our door. That's the difference between the pagan world or everybody else in the world, as the verse says, and those who call God Father. If the gods you worship, whether you acknowledge them or not, are distant or removed or impersonal or even non-existent, then of course you'll be worried. But if God's your Father and he calls you his child, and if he's your shepherd and he calls you one of his little flock, what's to stop you trusting him? Seek his kingdom, and all these things will be given to you as well. Seeking God's kingdom means bringing the values and the priorities of God himself to bear on the greed and the anxiety of our world. And so as we embrace our purpose by seeking first his kingdom, let's abandon the latter, the greed and the anxiety, and let's live for the former, the values and the priorities of God himself. So when we're inclined to worry, let's not only remember our worth and accept our limits, let's embrace our purpose. And as we live in a way that manifests our trust in God's care rather than our anxiety, Jesus' encouragement to us is that we'll find our joy and our purpose along with his peace in an age of anxiety. It might be the case for you that you've never really heard or understood up until now that you're that valuable to Jesus, that you're worth that much to him. Or maybe you've never actually accepted that you have limits, that you don't have the ability to save yourself, and that you needed Jesus to die for you in your place. It might even be that you've never understood that you've got a Father in heaven who promises to provide what you need and has a purpose for your life so that you don't need to worry. Paul writes to the Romans that he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? God the Father didn't withhold his only son from you. So why would he withhold anything else? He's graciously longing to give you all that you need so that you don't need to worry. If you've never received Jesus, if you've never trusted your life into God's care and you'd like to, then I would love to speak with you after the service. I'll just be down the front here. And I'd love to help you take that next step. Or you could ask someone over at the Connect Lounge following the service, or one of the prayer team. They would love to help you and to pray with you. Or if you're watching online, you can go to our Connect link and click on more about Jesus and follow the links there, and someone will be in touch. Why don't we pray together? Jesus, thank you that when you ask us, why do you worry? And you tell us that we don't need to, that you give us so many reasons not to, but more than that, you give us yourself. Help us to know how valuable we are to you and to remember our worth in your eyes. Help us to know that worrying doesn't achieve a thing, and so to accept our limits, trusting you for the things we simply cannot do or control or provide for ourselves. And help us not to fear, knowing that you're our shepherd and our Father, and that it pleases you to give us everything so that we lack nothing, everything that we need. God, thank you that we can trust you. And as we seek you and your kingdom first, may we embrace your purpose for our lives. And we pray these things in the name of Jesus.